بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. محاضرة اليوم تحت عنوان المدخل إلى الشعر الإنجليزي المعاصر لطلبة المرحلة الرابعة، يلقيها المدرس خالد قيس عبد، جامعة الأنبار، كلية التربية للعلوم الإنسانية، قسم اللغة الإنجليزية. Good morning, dear students.
Good morning.
Today's lecture is going to give you a critical introduction to the poetry of the modern age, or what is so-called modern poetry. First of all, you are going to have an idea about what is meant by the term modern or modernism. Where does this term come from? And then we are going to give you a literary and historical background about the circumstances and the factors behind the emergence of such a new tendency or movement. This lecture will also give you a hint about the general characteristics of the modern poetry, and you will have an idea why this poetry is difficult or complex. What is the cause of this complexity or difficulty, in order to be able to decipher this complexity and write down a good and succinct critical appreciation of each poem written during that time. Also, we're going to have an idea about, let us say, the poetic creativity of the modern age and the relationship or the role of the psychoanalysis mainly established by the Austrian psychiatrist named Sigmund Freud. And then we are going to give you an idea about how to appreciate what are the standards of appreciating a modern poem in order to be able to grasp the meaning of the poet. First of all, the beginning of the 20th century was a period of a wide turmoil and suffering. Both European and American society witnessed great drastic changes. The two world wars had shattered the world and affected almost every aspect of it. You know that in the first half of the 20th century, the two world wars happened. Yes. And the first world war happened in 1914 and ended into the year or the date 1918. The aftermath of that war affected almost every aspect of life. So the thought and the faith of the individual was changed, because it was an era of crises, of wars, of conflicts, and of struggles. All in all, this age witnessed all these changes and resulted into a birth of a new culture, a culture that is reinvented. And this is all in all called the spirit of modernism, or what is so-called modern spirit, referring to the first half of the 20th century, so far as art and literature in general and poetry in particular. Have a look at this slide. This is a complete definition of the term or the tendency or the movement modernism. Modernism is a comprehensive term or a tendency which began to emerge in the early 20th century and which had a wide influence internationally at that time. It reflects a sense of cultural crisis which has both exciting and disquieting, in that it opened up a whole new vista of human possibilities at the same time as putting into question any previously accepted means of grounding and evaluating new ideas. Modernism is marked by experimentation, particularly manipulation of form, and by the realization that knowledge is not absolute. This is an intensive definition of the term modernism, and you know that the first part of this definition refers to what does this term mean. Modern means the decline of all traditions of the previous time, as far back as the 16th century poetry up to the very late of the 19th century, I mean the Victorian age. Modern writers believe that all these traditions are no longer useful or reliable to fulfill the needs of the readers who are living under all these pressures, wars, crises, conflicts, and loss of identity, because you know of the aftermath of the First World War, which resulted into the corruption of the society and the unemployment, poverty, ignorance. So people or readers of that age are no longer fulfilled by the traditional forms of poetry and art in general. So they feel for They feel that they need for new forms, which are always either exceptional or untraditional. The second part of the definition, which I would like you to focus upon, in that it opened up a whole new vista of human possibilities, at the same time as putting into question. It means reconsidering, reinventing any previously accepted means of grounding and evaluating new ideas. So anything that is used or employed in the previous times is no longer useful. This comes, in fact, from a phrase used by the American poet Ezra Pound in his poems and works. Make it new. It has frequently repeated. Make it new. Make it new. And it is taken by the critics as a call for the modern spirit. Exactly, modernism started into 1910 and ended into 1945. But after that, postmodernism is a continuation of the modern spirit. It doesn't mean that it has been finished in 1945. But after that year, the postmodern started, but it is considered by the critics as a continuation of the modern spirit or a continuation of modernism. General features of modernism. As I told you, modernism was built on a sense of lost community and civilization, and was made up of a series of contradictions. Embraced multiple features of modern sensibility. So everything is treated to be a modern, a new. So the past community and civilization were all declined. They were lost because they are no longer useful or reliable to achieve the goal of the literature written during that age, or at least fulfill the needs of the readers. This change is considered from 2 points. First, loss of a sense of a tradition. Second, increasing dominance of technology. Thematic features of the modern poetry, or the modern literature in general, including poetry. Intentional distortion of shapes. And this is a very important point, because now you are going to realize what are the roots of difficulty and complexity in this type of poetry. What is meant by the word distortion? What does it mean? Yes?
Damage.
Good. Something like a damage. Thing that is abnormal. Or sometimes unprecedented. This is the distorted images, distorted forms. It means or relates in poetry to the breakdown of the poetic traditions. There is no stanza form. There is no stanza form. No rhyme, no rhythm, and no any given poetic tradition at that time. This is distorted of the given poetic traditions of all the previous times. Focus on form rather than meaning. Now the shape, the form, and the structural aspects of the poem are more important to the readers and writers than the content or the theme or the implication of any work. Breakdown of social norms and cultural values. I repeat again, all the given traditions, values, declined, broken down because they are no longer fulfilling the needs of the modern reader. He is suffering, and he is getting through the many crises, just like nowadays. Moral crises, social crises, even political crises, and sometimes financial crises, which resulted into poverty in the society. Dislocation of meaning and sense from its normal context, another root of difficulty. Now, meaning and sense of form were dislocated from its normal and given context, being put into something that is either symbolic or elusive in order to drag the reader's attention. And I told you, the reader is suffering. He needs to read a kind of poetry to express his shattered dreams, rejection of history and substitution of a mythical past. They are related to mythical past as something that is fruitless or something that is aimless. It doesn't serve the purpose of the poet, so they relate to what? To new traditions. Past and mythology is not necessarily reliable. But this is, of course, not adopted by all the poets. Some of them are, you see, still using. Yes. But for a modern demand, a modern intention, you know. Need to reflect the complexity of modern urban life. As you know, almost every place in the European society was changed from rural to urban. And you know, modernity becomes, you see, a tradition, a way of life. So they feel that it is very important for a literary man, whether a novelist or a playwright or a poet or even an artist, to reflect clearly the complexity of the life they are living. Importance of the unconscious mind. And this is also a relationship. It talks about, this point talks about the relationship between the conscious and unconscious mind, and it is related to the psychology of the reader and also the psychological aspect which is taken into account by the writer or the author. Interest in the primitive and non-Western cultures. Writers of that age are always interested in the primitive, to the very far past, to be put into new formula or a new frame with a modern intention. They also related to the culture that is out of the Western culture, either from European or from other cultures like the Oriental or the many other cultures in the world. They feel that the European culture alone is not enough to enrich their works and achieve their goals throughout their writings. Impossibility of an absolute interpretation of reality. Overwhelming technological changes. As I told you, technology got into a very hasty and very callous development during that age, and even right now, the development of science and technology invades all the aspects of life. And this resulted into what? Into the high cost of living, you know. Now, a very high range of people are poor in almost every country in this world. Okay? And it resulted also into unemployment. So getting a job or a source of living becomes somehow possible in some countries. And you see, it is the mission, the goal, the message of the writer or the poet to call for overwhelming these technological changes. Now I told you in the last point but one, psychology has an essential or vital role in the shaping form of the modern literature in general. And you know, it is related to the psychoanalysis of the people, whether in novel or in drama or even in poetry. And psychoanalysis as a branch or a school in psychology was coined by the Austrian psychotherapist and psychologist named, you know him, Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1938. The contributions of this author or scholar, he discovered a new method to investigate the mind through analysis of dreams and the free associations. He has published a very important book entitled Interpretation of Dreams, and this is taken by the poets and other writers into account, and they have written certain works regarding this contribution so far as psychoanalysis or psychology is concerned. He is known for his theories of unconscious mind and the difference. Now the conscious mind is no longer useful for the modern writers. So in order to be creative, they resorted to their unconscious mind as a kind of poetic creativity to write down something that fulfills the needs of the reader of the modern age. So he has written certain essays related to the unconscious mind and many other books and experiences related to the defense strategy, mechanism of repression. Renowned for his redefinition of instinctual desire as the primary motivational energy of a human life, directed toward wide variety of objects. In one of his essays entitled Beyond the Pleasure Principle, write it down please. Beyond the Pleasure Principle. This essay was a result of a series of experiences on certain individuals at that time. It was first translated by James Starchay into English, of course, in which he talks about the theory of instincts in the human psyche and how man suffers from the conflict of these instincts, and he puts man or the human psyche into or between two principles, the pleasure principle and the reality principle. He refers to the pleasure principle when man gratifies his needs to avoid pain. But when man is unable to gratify his needs and avoid pain, he will be changed from the pleasure principle into the reality principle by delaying this change. So there is a conflict between these two principles, and this conflict is instinctual. It means that it is found in every human psyche. In the early 20th century, most poets are interested in the Freud and the psychoanalytical studies of poetry and other arts. The translations of his works, like The Interpretation of Dreams, first published in 1912, and a very distinct essay, I recommend you to read it, entitled Beyond the Pleasure Principle, first published in 1920, and other books tackling the theory of instincts and the pleasure and reality principles, which sum up man's struggle in the life, offers keys to the relationship between art and the unconscious themes of the artist. So in almost every poetry, have you started dealing with T.S. Eliot?
Yes.
You know, Alfred Prufrock was presented by the poet as a victim, right? So from a psychological reading of the poem, the last three lines. This man is put between these two principles, and he is struggling in the life because he is unable to fulfill his needs as a man. So he moves from pleasure principle into the reality principle. This is an example. Formal features of poetry. Poetry is written in an open form. There is no meters, no stanza form, okay, and no any metric traditions used by those poets. They write poetry freely. Okay, so all traditions, like for example rhyme, rhythm, couplets, tercets, and all the other meters, they are no longer used by the poet. So it may be possible to find a poem without any poetic tradition. Use of free verse. So they write poetry freely without considering to any poetic canon or tradition. Juxtaposition of ideas rather than consequential exposition. They are also talking about idea, and their main intention is to communicate them to the readers. Use of allusions and multiple association of the words. Borrowing from other cultures and languages. So you may find an epigraph in a poem written in French, for example. Okay? Unconventional use of metaphor. Metaphor is not used as you know. It goes into levels, and these levels are determined by the poet according to the theme he is writing about. Importance given to sound to convey the music of ideas. Sometimes themes are conveyed musically, either through the form of the poem or through considering the musical aspect of the poem. Free verse. It is written through the use of poetic line, flexibility of line length, Massive use of alliteration and assonance. No use of traditional metric forms. No rhyme, no rhythm, no assonance, and no any other metric form that we have studied from the 16th century poetry up to the closing years of the late 19th century. No regular rhyme scheme. Use of visual images in distinct lines. Next lecture, inshallah, I'm going to talk about the main movements in English literature, including poetry. Imagism is one of them. We are going to talk in details about this point. Use of visual images. They are devoted, poems devoted to convey a visual image. So when you are reading the poem as if you are drawing something, or you are looking at certain visual image that is drawn in your mind. That is drawn in your mind as a reader. Modern poetry in English was rooted in the idea that, now we are, you see, talking about the poetry of that age. Modern poetry in English was rooted in the idea that traditional forms of art, literature, social organization, and daily life had become outdated. They are old. Okay? They no longer fulfill the needs of the readers. And that it is essential to push them aside and reinvent culture. That is what is new, is modern. So even right now, anything that is new, used for the first time, it is called modern. It encouraged the idea of re-examination of every aspect of the art of poetry with the aim of finding that which was holding back and replacing it with the new and better ways to reach the same end. So modern in poetry refers to using new strategies, new thoughts, new visions, and new techniques to reach the same end. What is this end? Is to communicate the idea of the writer to his readers who are living in an exceptional, in a very drastic circumstances. I repeat, it was an age of wars, conflicts, struggles, and even an age of the many crises. So it is somehow difficult to communicate the ideas with the traditional ways or methods. Now we move to the characteristics of modern poetry. These are very important because they will give you a hint how to appreciate a modern poem. These are general and they will help you to, first of all, to pass your judgment whether this poem is written during the modern age or not. And if you find at least one of these characteristics in a poem, you will of course be able to appreciate it critically. As an outcome of these changes I have just mentioned, modern poetry is characterized by the radical break with the traditions of literary subjects, forms, concepts, and styles. In the poetry of that era, modern elements can be appreciated in terms of the following. We have four standards you should take into account when you start reading and you see appreciating a modern poem. A. New experiments in form and style. So when you read a poem and you don't find any form or style that you have studied in the previous semesters, I mean in the previous literary periods, you should know that it is a modern poem. New themes and word games. As I told you, there is no rhyme and rhythm. And even the theory of poetic diction are no longer used. So the poet is supposed to play with words. This is so-called puns or word plays in language. So if you find that the language is sometimes not clear or the whole text of the poem is not coherent, it means that the poet wants to communicate a new theme, but he plays with words in order to drag the reader's attention to grasp, to dig deeply and find what does this poet want to communicate, which problem, which crisis. Okay? New modes of expression. Each theme the poet intends to talk about requires certain type according to what is determined by the poet or what he finds according to his vision to find it possible or reliable enough to communicate his themes. complex and elusive implications and intentions. I told you complexity is one of the essential or distinct characteristics of modern poetry. I'm going to talk about it right now. Complexity. Inshallah, in this semester we are going to give you a workshop under this title, towards deciphering the complexity of modern poetry. We shall talk about in details about how to overwhelm or decipher the complexities and degrees of difficulties of the modern poetry. Complexity in modern poetry comes from the fact that the first half of the 20th century was a time of crises and conflicts dominated by the impact of the First World War, which saw, as Peter Faulkner, he's a writer, he mentions in his book entitled Modernism, the Critical Idiom. He has written a book entitled Modernism, the Critical Idiom. I have quoted these lines. He says about modernism, as the final demise of an ideal cultural and social order established as far back as the 16th century. So it was this age, I mean by the beginning of the 20th century, represents a watershed in the history. A total change of all the dominant rules and the principles in all literature and art, and starting a new era that is the modern, and everything is reinvented. Another characteristic is the anti-romantic attitude. First of all, I would like you to recall with me, when you studied British romantic poetry, you know we have romantic traditions. That is the theories mainly established by Wordsworth and Coleridge, and they are written in the preface to their book entitled Lyrical Ballads. The theory of imagination, theory of the treatment of poetic diction by Wordsworth, and the characteristics of romantic poetry, like subjectivity, simplicity of language, spontaneity, and their coinage of the poet and poetry. And you know that Wordsworth defines poet as a spontaneous overflow of moments recollected, of emotions recollected in a moment of serenity and tranquility. And he consider, or all of them, consider a poet as a man talking to me. It relates to the simplicity, and all these traditions are called the romantic canon. It means the romantic poetic traditions. Modern writers now, all of modern writers disagree with this tradition. So they are anti-romantic in their attitude. They say that if a poet resorts to his imagination, he is in result, as Eliot says, a bad poet or a critic. Why? Because they say that poetry should be realistic. It should share the sufferings of the reader. So things which are subjective are not useful, okay, or are not noteworthy by readers of that age. So all major poets of the modern age expressed their dislike for the romantic poets. They realized that it was no longer possible in the present century to compose poems in a manner in which Wordsworth and Coleridge wrote. The romantic mood could not accommodate the ironical and sophisticated modern experience. So life itself is complex. So things which are traditional are not incoincidental. This language or this kind of poetry cannot accommodate such a sophisticated period of history. Concerned with form, modern poets often focus on form rather than theme or content. In withdrawing from the general experience to more unique and personalized one, it has been observed that modern poetry has been preoccupied with form. I would like to explain what is meant by form. Form is divided into two levels, narrow and wide. Michael Robert remarks, in the narrow sense of the word form is used to describe special metrical and stanzaic patterns. This is the narrow sense of the word or term form in poetry. In a wider sense, It is used for a while for a whole set of relationships involving sensuous imagery and the rhetoric of the poem. This is what is meant by the term form in poetry. Intellectual slant. As we referred, modern poets or writers in general intend to reinvent culture. Okay, they went to make something new, something that is not traditional, not used by the writers of the previous times. So they intend to create something new, to be creative. They resort to intellectual slant. Slant means tendency or trend. By rejecting romantic conventions, modern poets adopt a highly intellectual mode of expression and apprehension of experience. Thus, Eliot, Pound, Auden, and Stevens have been charged with the mental snobbery. What does that mean? It means that they resort to intellectual implications, things related to either to art and philosophy to enrich their works. And Eliot has written many essays. He is very interested in the metaphysical poets of the 17th century. And you see, they have been accused by, or they have been blamed by the critics as having mental snobbery. Okay? From this unique perspective, as man is presented as a victim of his hair surrounding, Freud coins the psychoanalytical terms to clarify man's reaction to the instinctual pulses or the social pressures directed towards him. So now the modern writer feels that it is very important to relate to the psychological or psychoanalytical perspective of the man, and also to take it into account throughout the work they are writing, because they want to clarify, to explicate whether man is suffering because of his instinctual pulses. I told you there is an internal conflict, or by the external pressures put in, the social pressures directed towards him. It means that in the society in which he lives, you see, summed up by the circumstances he or she is living, that is wars, conflicts, poverty, ignorance, and the need in all its shapes